Wylie Avenue Days is just one of WQED's home video collection. Other titles include Kennywood Memories, Things That Aren't There Anymore, Holy Pittsburgh, and The Spirit of Pittsburgh. For your copies of these shows, call collect or write to QED Enterprises. If you like Wylie Avenue Days, you're going to like the others. Distribution of Wylie Avenue Days is made possible in part by Duquesne Light Company, supporting the energy needs of the Pittsburgh area for over 100 years.
This program is made possible by all the wonderful people who are members of WQED.
This program is part of WQED's Pittsburgh History Series.
Some Pittsburghers used to call this neighborhood Little Harlem, but most people have always called it the Hill District, or just the Hill. From the 30s through the 50s, the Hill thrived, and part of it was one of the most lively, prosperous, and influential black neighborhoods in America.
We had 5 theaters, we had drugstores, we had furniture stores. Whatever there was in the city, we had in the Hill.
The Hill District was for the Pittsburgh area what Harlem was to New York. It was a center for music, for art, for literature.
The Hill was a thriving, bustling, safe community.
I thought it was the most exciting place I'd ever been in my life.
One street ran the entire length of the Hill into downtown, Wylie Avenue.
Wylie Avenue was the center of all kinds of activity, and it really ran 24 hours a day. It's the only street in a metropolitan city in America that begins at a church and ends at a jail.
Wylie Avenue represented the heart and soul of the Hill when the Hill was in its heyday. This program is the story of those magic times, what we're calling Wylie Avenue Days. Just east of downtown Pittsburgh, beyond the Civic Arena, lies the neighborhood called the Hill. Much of what used to be the Hill is gone now. The Civic Arena is where the lower hill used to be. And when you drive through the upper half, you discover a neighborhood struggling to renew itself. But it wasn't always this way. When Pittsburgh was the Smoky City, the Hill was a jumping-off point for immigrants. Then, large numbers of African Americans fleeing persecution in the South and seeking jobs in the industrial Promised Land came to the Hill. During that period, from the mid-1930s to almost the 1960s, they created a diverse and powerful black community.
There was practically every kind of business that you would want, especially to do shopping. You could buy your school clothes and not leave the Hill. You could buy fresh meat.
It was its own world. It was a unique demographic phenomenon. I mean, it was unique in and of itself. The way the various groups lived and worked and interacted with each other was unique.
There were black-owned and operated jewelry shops, dry cleaners, doctors' and lawyers' offices, printing shops, summer camps, and much more. Yeah, the Hill was really jumping. Open all night. That's the way most people describe the Hill in its heyday. The place really hummed, and you went along for the ride whether you wanted to or not. Take, for example, Good's Pharmacy on the corner of Fullerton and Wylie. Bill Good's sister, Ruth White, managed the fountain on opening night.
We opened, it was going to be open till 11 o'clock at night. And there's so many people were in the store at 11 o'clock, and they kept coming in. Every time we decided we were going to close, more people would come in, and people were in there all night. And that's when he decided we might as well throw the key away and just keep the store open 24 hours. And that's how it became a 24-hour drugstore, the first night.
Good's had an unbeatable location. In fact, the corner of Fullerton and Wylie became known as the Crossroads of the world.
Everything happened on that corner. Stanley's was across the street, and it was, of course, a bar and a nightclub. And Woogie's Barbershop was down at the other corner, and Crawford Grill #1 was at the corner across from Woogie's Barbershop, and people just came and went all the time. It was never a dull moment in that store at night.
The Hill just wasn't a dull neighborhood. In fact, the Hill nurtured some great talents. Billy Eckstein, Lena Horne, Errol Garner, Ahmed Jamal, and Mary Lou Williams. They all lived in the Hill at one time or another. So did jazz great George Benson.
Georgie Benson? I watched Georgie Benson sell papers right there on the corner in front of the drugstore. He'd come in and he'd say to me, "Miss Ruth, would you loan me 3 cents so I can get an ice cream cone?" And I think now, when I think of how well he's doing, these are the days that you remember.
Everyone who grew up in the Hill in those days has some magic memories of the place. Louise Evans moved to Pittsburgh when she was 9 years old from Egypt, North Carolina. To her, Wylie Avenue seemed like another world.
Oh my, yes. It seemed like people never went to bed. And old men would sit out and play checkers until way over into the night. And the people sat out on their stoops and hollered back and forth to one another. And in those days, you could sleep on the fire escapes. Many times it would be so hot, we would get out on the fire escapes and take a sheet or an old quilt and sleep on the fire escapes. But I don't know when the people went to bed. I really don't, because I would just last as long as I could, and then I'd wake up and it would be morning with the soot in the nostrils and oily skin. You had soot on your face too.
Jim Henry was born at home here on the corner of Wanlis and Webster. One of his fondest memories is of getting Sunday dinner.
Mrs. Williams had a live chicken store right on Center Avenue up from Kirkpatrick, and you'd go in and she'd pick out a chicken, go in the back room, you'd hear a little noise, and she had a big pot of hot water, and boom, she wrapped it up in some wax paper, and that was dinner the next day.
Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright August Wilson grew up on Bedford Avenue.
I guess my earliest memories of 3rd, 4th grade, coming home from school. And as I got older, I gradually came to understand that we lived in a mixed neighborhood. The neighborhood was a lot of Syrians, a lot of Italians, blacks. It was, in every sense of the word, a neighborhood.
People with names at hard times, and Fluvanna. I never did know what Fluvanna meant, but there was a man named Fluvanna. When he was sober, he stuttered and you could hardly understand him, but boy, when he got drunk, he sounded like a English lord. Well, there was a man that they called Death. He was very skinny, and it was obvious that he was not well, but people called him Death. Church, the one-legged man with all the keys on his belt, and he was an electrician. And I don't know why they called him Church, because he was the most profane man I've ever heard. Just every other word that came out of his mouth was a cuss word.
Albert Johnson remembers going to the movies.
At that time, they only cost 12 cents, but boy, you had to really scuffle to get 12 cents. You collected pop bottles and everything else you could do, ran errands to get that 12 cents.
Mike Flournoy moved to Pittsburgh from Birmingham, Alabama. In Birmingham, he got used to a lot of greenery.
Pittsburgh didn't have any greenery. And one of my greatest experiences was to witness houses that sat so close to the street that I had to learn some new skills. And one of the skills I had to learn was how to avoid automobiles within 2 seconds after you step outside of the house.
Black immigrants who moved to the Hill from the South faced other challenges too. The Great Migration reached its peak during the Depression, but many blacks came here during World War I. Estelle Blanks remembers that in 1917, life was hard. That's the year she followed her husband to Pittsburgh to escape poverty and repression in Lowndes County, Alabama. But the conditions they found here weren't much better at first.
When he came here, the people were living in cellar, dirt floors. Some of them had to sleep on the floor, on dirt floors, because they didn't have nowhere to stay.
University of Pittsburgh professor Rollo Turner says some of the men lived in boxcars on the railroad.
Literally, the railroad companies would string together a bunch of boxcars, cut holes in the cars for windows, and then charge them in 5 cents a night to sleep in them. And I think Pittsburgh was second to North New Jersey in terms of bad housing at this time, and certainly had one of the highest tuberculosis rates within the black community.
Eventually, Congress passed legislation to improve living conditions. And as more and more poor Southern blacks arrived and mixed with those blacks who were already here and prospering, the stage was set. Black institutions developed that were unrivaled in their scope and breadth.
They thrived because, in part, because of segregation and racism and discrimination. There was a world, there were boundaries to that world, primarily established by a white community. But within that world, people developed institutions that had their own character, their own strength, their own power. They were truly strong institutions.
One of the strongest institutions in the Hill was this newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier. Its offices were near the top of Wylie Avenue. The Courier started out as a small neighborhood weekly. Albert Johnson remembers how it quickly became an important paper.
When we were little, if you wanted to find out something about some other part of the country, as far as black people were concerned, the Courier was the only source. Unless it was something that impacted on the white community, black news was no news.
Under the leadership of its publisher, Robert L. Vann, the Pittsburgh Courier grew into the largest black weekly in America. There was a Pittsburgh City edition, a national edition, and 14 special regional editions, one for each of the country's major cities.
They didn't have television, so you read the papers. You went out and bought the paper. We didn't miss buying the Courier on Thursday. That's the first thing you bought. You know, if you went to the store, you stopped to buy the Courier. You read that Courier because anybody who was anybody was in that Courier. And you knew what they were doing because you read the Courier. Yeah.
Today, the new Pittsburgh Courier publishes out of these offices on the South Side. Getting the paper delivered to its readers is pretty routine now. But distributing the paper across the nation in the 30s and 40s was a challenge. Rod Doss recalls one of the obstacles.
In the early days of the Courier, it was very difficult for papers to be sent down south and placed strategically in a lot of stores.
White companies would often refuse to transport or deliver a colored newspaper. To get the paper out, the Courier called on the president of the Pullman Porters, the union of black men who worked as porters on trains across the country.
He consigned a lot of his porters to make sure that the papers were delivered to strategic points down south. And hence that's how the Courier emerged as the leader with the largest amount of circulation in southern states at that time.
Even though the Courier was a national paper, a lot of its news still came from the bustling Hill and Wylie Avenue. So did its pictures. A whole generation of black photographers worked on the Courier. One of them was Teenie Harris.
You know, I never went to school. I didn't take no pictures and no photography in school. I learned all this by just myself.
During his career, Teenie took over 80,000 pictures of black life in Pittsburgh. But while other photographers could take several different shots of each news event, Teenie only took one. And one day, when he was covering Governor Lawrence, that earned him a permanent nickname.
They're all out there with a little old 35 millimeters snapping, and I'd be sitting back and waiting on them, and Governor Lawrence would hunch the other fellow, said, "Here he comes now." He said he called me One Shot.
One Shot Harris couldn't afford to use more than a single frame of film and a single flash bulb to capture his subject. Then he'd pop the used flash bulb into his pocket to make the point.
I just, after I snap you like this, and I just grab the ball and put it in my pocket. See, I used to play basketball, you know.
Besides national issues, the Courier devoted sections to sports, religion, cooking and the home, and the society scene along Wylie Avenue. Clubs for women and men were an important part of that scene. In the 40s, these back issues of the Courier listed over 50 different organizations for women. A woman could join the Aurora Reading Club, the Pittsburgh Pioneers, or a group called the Ducks. There were clubs for men too. Some of them grew out of business relationships, like the Black Professional Association. But one of the most well-known and influential clubs in the Hills started purely for fun, the Frogs. It's still around today. David Washington and Percy Garland are two of its members.
Well, there's limited places you could go for social affairs. You couldn't have a social affair in downtown Pittsburgh or any of the Class A establishments or restaurants or hotels or anything. So it was a special community that blacks had to establish.
The Frogs, the name stands for Friendly Rivalry Often Generates Success, have been meeting for dinner once a month since the early 1900s. They were famous for Frog Week, a summer week of parties, dances, concerts, games, and the Frog Formal.
People would come from California to Chicago, down south, from all points of the country to be here for Frog Week, and it was a very, very, very fine affair, and was well behaved. It was a very nice affair. It was just about the nicest thing that you could attend.
Most of the Frogs were also members of another, larger men's club, the Lewindie Club. The Lewindie Club had its own 3-story building near the corner of Wylie and Fullerton.
It had a great deal of camaraderie, and everyone you knew there was interesting.
If there were black celebrities in town, you would probably end up rubbing elbows with them at the Lewindie. Count Basie and Duke Ellington were regulars. Frank Bolden, a reporter for the Courier, remembers one night the Lewindie earned its place in the history of jazz.
Duke Ellington used to sit in there. One night he was in there playing, and we had Gumdrops there with us, and we called him Gumdrops. That's Earl Garner. His nickname was Gumdrops. You get him to play all night for a bag of Gumdrops. Then later we went around to Lewindie Club, and Duke sat there until 7 in the morning. He finished the composition, I Let a Song Go Out of My Heart. He finished it right there in Lewindie Club.
I let a song go out of my heart. It was the sweetest melody. I know I lost heaven when you were apart from me.
A night out on the social scene meant looking good from head to toe. There was no place to get that do done better than at LaSalle's. Walona Graves, who's demonstrating the finger wave here, owned LaSalle's. It was a salon and beauty college, and Walona's sisters worked for her. They remember what she wanted to do for young black women.
To teach some of, especially our girls, the colored girls, that's what we were called at that time, to be able to do something else beside housework for the white people. We wanted them to be able to work for themselves. She was the first one to have black and white students in her school, and so many students have went on to their own business and are still operating today.
LaSalle's didn't discriminate when it came to students or customers. White or black, you could get the latest styles at LaSalle's. Of course, that might mean you had to get wired into this contraption.
The permanent wave then had to be wrapped on little rods, and electricity was used a certain amount of time to set the wave in the permanent. No one was never electrocuted, no.
According to a 1936 beauty supply catalog, this was the ideal of beauty for blacks. If you believed it, then you bought chemicals, relaxers, and what they called fade creams to give you that light, bright, and almost white look. Many advertisers successfully played upon the myth that the whiter you were, the more beautiful you looked. But by this time, many of the Hill's residents had their own ideas about black beauty and held contests to prove it. These women are competing in the Miss BPA beauty pageant, sponsored by the Black Professional Association. It ran for a full week and culminated with a swimsuit competition and talent show. Albert Johnson remembers how much everyone enjoyed the pageant.
All the young fellas looked forward to the beauty pageant. That was the beauty crown of Pittsburgh. It was the one that everybody shot for.
To get into this pageant, you had to be sponsored by a club or a business.
If they had a pretty waitress in the group or they had a pretty employee who had some talent, that was the person who would represent their business. It was a lot of fun.
The pageants, the frogs, and the private clubs were the height of sophistication in the Hill. But the really big event was just the opposite. The summer picnic.
There were games. All of the games were competitive manual games. There were races. There was a prize drawing. And there was something for everybody. It was a real fun country picnic. And the Hill District would practically be vacated.
The picnic started early and lasted well into the night. There were all kinds of entertainment, big band concerts, dances, and talent shows, like this exotic South Seas review. Most of the events at the summer picnic were at Sully's Pool in South Park. Things got a little crowded at times, but it was Sully's or nothing. It was the only pool where blacks were admitted.
Now, at that time, there was a large pool, a very, very large pool at South Park, which African Americans were not allowed to go in. See? In fact, if you tried to go there, chances are that you would end up in the hospital, if not dead.
Yet, despite discrimination and segregation, most people have fond memories of the picnics and the good times they had there.
What did we care? Because after all, we didn't have anything else. We enjoyed ourselves because at that time it was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So this was all right as far as we were concerned. It was in the 40s, really, when they had the picnics at Sully's Grove.
It was a very, very, very good, I have a very good memory of the picnic. And words can't do justice to the fun that everybody had.
The Hill had picnics and parties, but the real center of social life was the church, and the Hill has always had many distinguished churches. These scenes were shot outside of Ebenezer Baptist Church in the 1940s. That church at the top of Wylie Avenue is John Wesley AME Zion. There's also Mother Bethel, said to be the oldest congregation of color west of the Alleghenies. Bethel was the site of many civil rights meetings. And the Hill has supported many other congregations and denominations, like Warren United Methodist and Central and Monumental Baptist churches. Another well-known Hill church is St. Benedict the Moor, the first black Catholic church in Pittsburgh. It stands just a few blocks from Wylie Avenue, its center in Crawford. On its 100th anniversary, the parish celebrated with this special service. Father Louis Vallone, the priest here now, grew up in the Hill.
You came to the church for any and everything. You came on Sunday, for your prayers. You came on Saturday nights for the dances. You came through the week for education. That's where you met your future spouse. That's where you picked the children that your kids played along with. That's where you got guidance and advice. That's where you got material help.
Everyone is welcome at St. Benedict the Moor these days, but that wasn't always true. In the 30s, the bishop excluded whites from the congregation
because a number of whites were more drawn to the warmth, the closeness, the service, the activity going on, and the fact that the church was very poor, that the bishop thought that that would be not conducive to the independence of the black church, and so he forbid whites to come in and be members of it.
When you look at the hill from downtown, one of the first things you see is the statue on top of the church. It was erected in 1965. Today, it's the subject of some controversy. The statue's hands and face are white, but St. Benedict, the church's namesake, was black.
When the statue originally went up, the hands and face were black. He's been up there for 25 years, and the paint has simply worn off. I would be more than happy to restore the face and hands to the original black color, except no contractor that we've ever brought around has been willing to crawl all the way on up there and try to paint the face and hands to the original black.
In addition to churches, picnics, parties, and pageants, Wylie Avenue was also abuzz with businesses, some of which flourished because of the sorry fact that blacks were often not welcome outside of the Hill, as Douglas King remembers.
At that time, they couldn't go in most anywhere and sit down and eat. There was very few, even the Isley change that we had here in Pittsburgh, the ice cream place. I remember when I was a kid, we could not eat. We could go in and get an ice cream, but we couldn't sit down in the Isleys and eat the ice cream cone. We had to go outside, take it out with us.
You were unwelcome downtown, so you didn't go. Women could not go downtown and try on a dress. You had to buy things without trying them on. And as far as men were concerned, there were a lot of stores that didn't even want you in the store.
But things were different along Wylie Avenue.
In that time, black people needed white people or Jewish people or whatever, and they needed us too, because we had, what money we had was spent with them.
Practically every shop owner had a tab for families, and once payday came, I guess that was one of the things your father or mother did, was go around and pay on or pay off some of the tabs that they had accumulated between paydays.
Johnson Studios was one of the businesses that thrived in the Hill. It was run by Luther Johnson Sr., a commercial photographer, with the help of his son, Albert Johnson. He'll never forget one of the things his father filmed, the Black Professional Association Annual Parade. Every year it threaded its way through the crowded streets of the Hill and ended up on Wylie Avenue.
For a neighborhood parade, it was one of the biggest parades in the city. In fact, it might have been the biggest parade in the city for a neighborhood parade. The pride was there. You were always happy to see the representation of all of the things that you had worked for.
Most businesses had some kind of float. Here's the one for the Courier, and that one belongs to Johnson Studios. There are lots of stories about the businesses behind these floats. Take this one, for example, the Owl Cab Company. In the 30s and 40s, black-owned cabs were only allowed to pick up passengers in black neighborhoods.
If they got caught picking up someone downtown, the driver was arrested and the cab company was fined.
Here's a float for a business that made it big with pies, Nesbitt's. When you were looking for a good meal and a special dessert, the Hill had a lot to offer in the way of restaurants. One of the most well-known was at the corner of Wylie and Janella, Nesbitt's Pie Shop.
It was the class restaurant. If you wanted to eat in a nice environment, that was the place to go.
The dinner menu featured main courses, like Nesbitt's crispy, moist, and delicious fried chicken, and his mouth-watering, juicy, 1-inch thick slab of roast beef. And one thing was for sure, You wouldn't leave without trying one of the pies Nesbitt's made famous. Today, people still look hungry when you ask them about his strawberry, pumpkin, and coconut custard pies. And then there was the almost legendary sweet potato pie.
Sweet potato pie is one of the best pies in the world. It's made out of sweet potatoes or yams. It's like a custard pie, except for the fact that it's heavier than a custard pie. And there's nothing that tastes like it.
Another thing that made Nesbitt special was George Nesbitt. He's the one in the suit.
He was a personable fellow, and he was a Booker T. Washington devotee. He figured that blacks needed an economic base. He preached it all the time.
A few blocks down the street at 1411 Wylie Avenue was another successful black business, McAvoy's Jeweler. Here's Mr. McAvoy at work. And here's Mrs. McAvoy waiting on a customer. They worked hard together to make McAvoy's a success. Hard work paid off for other businesses too. Since 1947, William Pryor has been making fur coats in this shop near Wylie Avenue. This is his son, William Pryor Jr., and this is his grandson, William Pryor III.
When I was my grandson's age, 19 years old, I was one of the fastest operators in the East. And the person that taught me was one of the fastest, and of course I improved on what he did. See? So here I am today enjoying it.
Bill's speed and skill with these sewing machines helped him survive at the height of segregation in Pittsburgh. He remembers it as a time when colored people weren't allowed to compete with white people for most jobs. It was even harder for businessmen.
At that time, speaking of the colored people of Pittsburgh, you weren't accepted downtown. And there were very, very few jobs that were available and no space at all available.
Some discrimination was prohibited, but it usually popped up in a subtler form. There was a law against refusing space to merchants like Bill based on color. There was also a way around it.
And one of the ways, instead of telling you no, they just raise the price so you can't pay it. And that way, I'm not discriminating. I just charge you $150 for what costs $30.
To get around the segregation, black businessmen had to be creative. Bill Pryor was typical. Many coat buyers wouldn't buy from a black business. They went to the fashionable, white-owned stores downtown, where black people weren't allowed to shop. But these stores recognized the quality of Bill's work, so they sent the orders on to him. He would actually make the coat, then the store would sew on their own label.
A lot of the persons that didn't patronize me at that time, they would take their stuff into town, and then almost before they got back home, I should say, I would be called, Bill, come and this is what I want you to do. And I would make it and do it and return it to them, and this is how I survived until I could have my retail business.
Every facet of life along Wylie Avenue was influenced by segregation and discrimination. Just as the Hill developed its own businesses and social life, it also had its own brand of police. Take a closer look at this unit of Hill police marching in this parade. Almost all of them were over 6 feet tall. The one in front was Pittsburgh's first black police lieutenant, Jim Robinson. Under his leadership, the cops in the Hill did keep order, but they had to use their own methods. One of the best was tough as nails, so he was nicknamed Keg of Nails. When he was on his beat, he used the trolley line pose to keep order.
And they were hollow.